The gas station sat like a broken tooth against the endless Utah desert, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dying light. Sarah's car had died 20 miles back, her phone showing no signal, when the elderly man in the pristine white shirt approached with a gentle smile. "Trust me, I'll help you," he said, his voice warm as honey. Sarah Chen had learned long ago that the most dangerous predators wore the kindest faces. Standing beside her dead Honda Civic, dust coating her jeans and exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders, she studied the man approaching through the gathering dusk. Mid-70s, silver hair perfectly groomed, wearing slacks and a white button-down that somehow remained crisp despite the desert heat. Everything about him screamed wholesome respectability, from his gentle eyes to the way he clasped his hands behind his back as he walked. "Car trouble?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm Brother Matthews. Saw you from the road and thought you might need assistance." Sarah's training kicked in automatically, catalogued the exits, assessed the threat, note the details others missed. The man's shoes were expensive leather, barely scuffed. His watch was simple but costly. Behind him, a white passenger van idled in the gas station parking lot, too clean for rural Utah, windows tinted dark enough to hide passengers. "Battery died," she lied smoothly. The alternator had actually failed, but admitting complete mechanical breakdown felt like revealing weakness to a predator. "I was hoping to get cell service here. Call for help." Brother Matthews shook his head sympathetically. "No towers out this way for 30 miles, but don't you worry, my family runs a small community about 15 minutes north. We'd be happy to let you use our landline, maybe put you up for the night until we can get you sorted tomorrow." The offer was reasonable, generous even. So why did every nerve in Sarah's body scream danger? Maybe because she'd spent 7 years learning that human monsters rarely looked monstrous. Maybe because she'd seen too many crime scenes where kindness had been the bait. Or maybe because Brother Matthew's eyes didn't quite match his smile, too calculating, too hungry, like a hawk watching a mouse. "That's very kind," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm sure someone will come along soon." "In this heat? At night?" Brother Matthews gestured toward the darkening sky. "Gets down to 40 degrees out here after midnight. Your car's not running, which means no heat. The gas station closes at 8. He checked his watch. "That's 20 minutes from now." Sarah glanced toward the gas station's grimy windows. Inside, a teenage clerk was already counting down his register, clearly eager to escape. The nearest town was 40 miles in either direction. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour. "My community follows the Lord's teachings about hospitality," Brother Matthews continued. "We've helped many stranded travelers. Just last month, we assisted a young woman from California. Car broke down just like yours. Got her back on the road safe and sound." Something cold crawled up Sarah's spine. The way he said young woman lingered too long, too fond. And that phrase, "got her back on the road," felt rehearsed, like a line he'd used before. "I appreciate the offer, but please." Brother Matthews stepped closer, close enough that she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else. Disinfectant, maybe medical-grade soap. The desert isn't safe for a woman alone. There are dangerous people out there, drifters, addicts, people who prey on the vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sarah had once hunted those exact predators for a living, until the Martinez case destroyed everything she'd believed about justice and law enforcement, until she'd learned that sometimes the monsters wore badges or judicial robes or community leader smiles, just like Brother Matthews. "My husband knows where I am," she said, testing him. "He'll send someone looking if I don't check in." Brother Matthews' smile never wavered. "Of course. You can call him from our compound. Let him know you're safe." Wrong answer. A genuinely helpful person would have suggested calling police, AAA, any number of official resources. Brother Matthews went straight to getting her isolated at his location. The gas station's lights flickered off. The teenage clerk emerged, locked the door, and drove away in a battered pickup truck without even glancing their direction. Suddenly, the desert felt much larger and emptier. "Just for tonight," Brother Matthews pressed gently. "We have a lovely guest room, home-cooked meals. My wife makes the most wonderful apple pie you've ever tasted. In the morning our mechanic can look at your car, or we can drive you into town." Sarah looked at her dead car, at the empty highway stretching into darkness, at Brother Matthew's patient, predatory smile. She thought about the cash in her backpack, her fake identification, the skills she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Sometimes walking into the trap was the only way to spring it. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you for your kindness." Brother Matthew's smile widened, and for just a moment, something hungry flickered behind his grandfatherly facade. The coffee burned her tongue, but Sarah welcomed the pain. It grounded her in the present moment, away from the swirling thoughts that threatened to drag her back into familiar darkness. Elder Matthews sat across from her at the small kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of herbal tea. "You mentioned you were heading to Salt Lake City," he said, his voice carrying the gentle cadence she'd noticed earlier. "Family there?" Sarah hesitated. The lie came easier than the truth. "Job interview, marketing position." She forced a smile. "Nothing too exciting. Work is a blessing, whatever form it takes." His pale blue eyes studied her with an intensity that made her shift in her chair. "The Lord provides opportunities when we need them most." The kitchen felt smaller now, intimate in a way that set her nerves on edge. Family photos lined the mantel above a stone fireplace, Matthews with various groups of young people, all wearing the same beatific smiles. A large portrait dominated the center, a younger Matthews with a woman who shared his angular features and a teenage boy with kind eyes. "Your family?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the photos. Something flickered across his face, gone so quickly she almost missed it. "My late wife Rebecca and our son Samuel. Rebecca passed 5 years ago. Cancer." His fingers traced the rim of his mug. "Samuel serves his mission in Guatemala now, 2 years of bringing souls to Christ. I'm sorry for your loss. We're sealed for eternity. Death is merely a temporary separation." The certainty in his voice was absolute, unwavering. "Rebecca understood the importance of our work here. She helped me establish the sanctuary." "Sanctuary?" "A place for lost souls to find their way. People like yourself, stranded and searching." He leaned forward slightly. "You'd be surprised how many travelers find themselves in need of guidance out here. The desert has a way of stripping away pretense, revealing what lies beneath." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Sarah set down her mug and forced herself to maintain eye contact. "That's very charitable of you." "Charity is the pure love of Christ. Without it, we're nothing." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkness beyond. "Tell me, Sarah, what brings you to Utah? Really?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her purse, where old habits had led her to check for weapons that were no longer there. She caught herself, converting the motion into smoothing down her jacket. "I told you, job interview." "Yes, but what brings you to Utah? To this particular road, at this particular time?" He turned from the window, and in the lamplight, his face appeared different somehow, harder. "In my experience, people don't end up broken down in the middle of nowhere by accident. There's always a story." Sarah's pulse quickened. The room felt warmer, the walls closer. "Sometimes people just want a fresh start." Fresh starts require leaving something behind. His smile never wavered, but it no longer reached his eyes. "What are you running from, Sister Sarah?" The formal address chilled her. She stood slowly, calculating distances to the door, to potential weapons, to escape routes. Training she'd tried to bury clawed its way to the surface. "I should probably get some rest. Early morning and all." "Of course. Let me show you to your room." He moved toward a hallway she hadn't noticed before, his movements fluid and purposeful. "I've prepared the guest quarters. Very comfortable, very secure." The word secure carried weight she didn't like. Sarah followed him down a narrow corridor lined with more photographs, groups of young people, families, individuals with hollow eyes and grateful smiles. At the end of the hall, Matthews opened a heavy wooden door. The room beyond was simple but clean, A single bed with a quilted coverlet, a small dresser, and a window with heavy curtains already drawn. What made Sarah's blood freeze was the reinforced doorframe and the barely visible scratches around the window lock, the kind left by fingernails clawing desperately at wood. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, backing away from the doorway. "I should probably call a tow truck. Get my car fixed tonight." The way he said "insist" made it clear it wasn't a request. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, contingencies. The kitchen knives were too far away. The front door was behind him. The window in the room might be her only option if she could get to it. "You're very kind, but kindness is what separates us from the beasts, don't you think?" His hand moved to the door handle, and she noticed a key ring hanging from his belt. "Sleep well, Sister Sarah. Tomorrow we'll discuss your future." The door closed with a soft click that sounded remarkably like a lock engaging. The basement stretched further than Sarah had expected, a maze of concrete corridors that seemed to burrow deep into the Utah earth. Elder Morrison's flashlight beam danced ahead of them, casting long shadows that writhed like living things against the walls. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a metallic tang that made her stomach clench. "Just through here," Morrison said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "We keep the generator rooms separate from the main living areas. Safety protocols, you understand." Sarah nodded, though something about his tone had shifted. The warm, grandfatherly cadence from upstairs had taken on a different quality, more businesslike, almost clinical. She kept her distance, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. Old habits from her previous life whispered warnings she tried to ignore. "Storage rooms," Morrison explained, noticing her glance. "We keep supplies down here, bulk foods, emergency equipment. The church teaches us to be prepared for uncertain times." The explanation seemed rehearsed, too smooth. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Catalog exits, note structural weaknesses, identify potential weapons. The skills felt rusty but familiar, like speaking a language she'd tried to forget. She forced herself to focus on Morrison's back, on the simple task of following him to a generator that would restore power and normalcy to this situation. The corridor took a sharp turn, opening into a wider chamber. Morrison's flashlight swept across the space, revealing a more complex setup than Sarah had anticipated. Multiple rooms branched off from this central area, and she could see the soft glow of battery-powered lights emanating from several doorways. This wasn't just a basement, it was a carefully constructed underground facility. "Impressive operation you have here," she said, keeping her voice casual. "Must have taken years to build." Morrison paused, turning to face her. In the flashlight's glow, his features seemed different, harder somehow, as if he'd allowed a mask to slip. "The Lord provides for those who serve his purposes faithfully. We've been blessed with resources and volunteers to help with the construction." The way he said volunteers sent ice through Sarah's veins. She'd heard that particular inflection before, in briefing rooms and interrogation transcripts, when handlers discussed assets who weren't entirely willing participants. From somewhere deeper in the complex came a sound that made her blood freeze, a woman's voice, muffled but unmistakably crying. It was quickly suppressed, as if someone had covered the source, but the echo lingered in the concrete chambers. Morrison didn't react to the sound, didn't even acknowledge it. That was perhaps more disturbing than anything else. "The generator room is just ahead," he said, resuming his forward movement. "I'll need you to hold the flashlight while I work on the connections. These old systems can be temperamental." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The smart play was to continue the charade, to pretend she hadn't heard anything suspicious, hadn't noticed the excessive security measures or the too convenient breakdown that had isolated her here. But the crying woman changed everything. Someone else was trapped in this underground maze, and Sarah's conscience wouldn't let her simply walk away. They entered what Morrison claimed was the generator room. The space was larger than necessary for the modest equipment it contained, with several chairs arranged along one wall and restraint points that looked disturbingly well used. This wasn't a maintenance area. It was a holding cell. "Elder Morrison," she said carefully, "I think there might be some misunderstanding here." He turned toward her, and in the backwash of the flashlight beam, she saw his expression clearly for the first time since entering the basement. The kindly church elder was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, where she now noticed the outline of what could only be a weapon. "No misunderstanding at all, my dear," he said. "You're exactly where the Lord intends you to be. We've been expecting someone like you, alone, vulnerable, without anyone who'll miss you for quite some time." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The remote location, the convenient breakdown, the elaborate underground facility, none of it was coincidental. This was a trap, carefully baited and expertly sprung. She'd walked into it like a complete amateur, rusty skills and desperate circumstances making her careless. But Morrison had made one crucial error in his assessment. Sarah might be stranded and alone, but she was far from defenseless. The woman who'd spent years in the shadows before disappearing into domestic anonymity was still there, buried beneath layers of chosen normalcy. And she was about to make herself known. The basement stretched further than Sarah had imagined possible, a maze of interconnected rooms carved from the red rock beneath the house. Elder Morrison's flashlight beam danced across rough-hewn walls as he led her deeper underground, his cheerful demeanor unchanged despite the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. "Built this myself over the years," he said, pride evident in his voice. "The Lord provides the vision, and we provide the labor. Amazing what faith can accomplish." Sarah's bare feet found purchase on the uneven stone floor, each step sending jolts of pain through her injured ankle. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with the scent of earth and something else. Something organic and unsettling that made her stomach clench. "How deep does it go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Deep enough." Morrison paused at a heavy wooden door, fishing a ring of keys from his pocket. "The earth keeps things preserved, stable, away from prying eyes." The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the darkness. Morrison pushed the door wide, revealing a room lit by battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The space was furnished like a crude living area, a narrow cot, a folding table, a plastic chair, but it was the walls that made her blood freeze. Photographs covered every surface, dozens of them, all showing young women. Some appeared to be professional headshots, others candid shots taken from a distance. In the corner, a newer addition caught her eye, her own driver's license photo, enlarged and mounted alongside the others. "I know it seems overwhelming at first," Morrison said, misinterpreting her stunned silence. "But you'll come to understand. Each of these sisters was lost, just like you, wandering in darkness until the Lord guided them here." Sarah's training kicked in, muscle memory from years she'd tried to forget. Her eyes catalogued exits, just the door they'd entered through, weapons. Nothing immediately apparent, but the folding chair could work if necessary. Morrison was bigger than her, but he was also in his 60s and clearly trusted that the locked door was security enough. "Where are they now?" she asked, moving closer to the wall of photographs. "These other women?" "Safe," Morrison replied, his tone taking on an almost reverent quality. "Protected from the corruption of the outside world. Some have moved on to their eternal reward, of course. The flesh is weak, but the spirit endures." The casual way he spoke about death made Sarah's skin crawl. She forced herself to examine the photos more closely, looking for patterns, for information that might help her understand what she was dealing with. The women all appeared to be in their 20s or 30s, most with dark hair like hers. Several bore a striking resemblance to each other, or perhaps to someone specific. "They look alike," she observed. Morrison's face softened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. She had such beautiful dark hair, always wore it long, even as a child, His hand reached out to touch one of the photographs, his fingers trembling slightly. My Rebecca, lost to us too soon, corrupted by the world's influences. But the Lord has given me a chance to save others like her, to give them the guidance she rejected. Sarah's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. Morrison wasn't just a predator. He was a grieving father whose loss had twisted into something monstrous. The most dangerous kind of killer, one who believed his actions were righteous. I'd like to meet them, she said carefully. The other women who are here now. Morrison's smile returned, but there was something brittle about it now. In time, sister. First you need to rest, to heal, to begin your spiritual preparation. He gestured toward the cot. Everything you need is here. I'll bring you food and water, of course, and books, the scriptures mostly, but some other approved reading material. What if I want to leave? The question hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that belied his grandfatherly appearance. Why would you want to leave? There's nothing for you out there but temptation and sorrow. Here, you'll find purpose, peace. He moved toward the door, his bulk blocking her only escape route. The Lord has brought you here for a reason, Sarah. Fighting his will only brings suffering. As he stepped into the hallway, Morrison paused. I'll return with dinner in a few hours. I suggest you use the time for prayer and reflection. Consider how blessed you are to have been chosen for this sacred work. The door closed with a solid thunk, followed by the unmistakable sound of the lock engaging. Sarah stood alone in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the faces of Morrison's previous victims, her mind already working through escape scenarios. She'd underestimated him, mistaken religious fervor for harmless eccentricity. It was a mistake that might cost her everything, but it was also one she wouldn't make twice. The basement stretched further than Sarah had imagined possible, carved deep into the mountain bedrock. Elder Morrison's flashlight beam revealed a maze of interconnected chambers, each one carefully excavated and reinforced with timber supports. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying scents of damp earth and something else, something organic and wrong. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Morrison said, his voice echoing off stone walls. When I first discovered these natural caves 15 years ago, I knew he had guided me here for a purpose. Sarah's fingers traced the rough-hewn walls, noting the precision of the work. This wasn't the product of casual weekend digging. Someone had invested serious time, money, and expertise into this underground complex. Her mind catalogued exit routes automatically, a habit she'd tried to abandon but couldn't quite shake. They passed through an archway into a larger chamber lined with metal shelving units. Canned goods, water containers, medical supplies, and emergency equipment filled every available space. Morrison gestured proudly at the stockpiles. Preparedness is a sacred principle, he explained. We must be ready to care for the Lord's children when the world above fails them. The next room contained sleeping quarters, a dozen narrow beds arranged dormitory-style, each with a small trunk at its foot. Personal belongings sat on makeshift nightstands, photographs, books, toiletries. Sarah noticed the beds were different sizes, some clearly meant for children. Her chest tightened. How many people stay down here? She asked, fighting to keep her voice neutral. Numbers fluctuate. The lost souls who find their way to us often arrive unexpectedly, just as you did. Morrison's eyes gleamed in the flashlight's glow. Some stay briefly before moving on to their eternal rewards. Others remain longer, helping with our sacred work. They entered what appeared to be a workshop, hand tools hung from pegboards with military precision. A workbench held partially completed wooden crosses. The smell here was stronger, sweet decay masked by industrial bleach. Sarah's training kicked in, analyzing the space with cold efficiency she'd hoped never to need again. Morrison noticed her attention on the crosses. I craft these myself, each one blessed and consecrated for its holy purpose. The faithful deserve proper preparation for their journey home. Journey home. To our Heavenly Father, of course. His smile held too many teeth. though some require more guidance than others to accept their calling. A narrow corridor led to what Morrison called his counseling room. Inside, leather restraints were bolted to a metal chair facing a small altar. Religious texts sat open beside instruments Sarah recognized but refused to name. The walls bore stains that no amount of bleach could fully erase. "This is where I help the lost ones remember their true purpose," Morrison said, running his fingers along the chair's armrest. "Some arrive already broken by the world's cruelties. Others resist the Lord's plan initially. But in time, they all come to understand." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What happens to them afterward?" "They ascend, naturally, released from earthly suffering to embrace eternal peace." Morrison's tone suggested he was discussing weekend gardening plans. Their mortal remains receive proper blessing before joining the sacred earth outside. Nothing is wasted in the Lord's design. The final chamber was the largest, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above. Wooden pews faced a crude altar where symbols Sarah didn't recognize were carved into the stone. Animal bones hung from the walls in deliberate patterns. This wasn't standard Mormon theology. This was something else entirely, something that had twisted religious devotion into justification for horror. "My private chapel," Morrison said with obvious pride, "where the chosen few receive final blessings before their ascension. The acoustics are quite remarkable. Every prayer, every confession, every cry of revelation echoes perfectly." Sarah focused on breathing steadily, calculating distances and angles. 3 exits she'd counted so far, but all led deeper underground. The workshop contained potential weapons, though Morrison still carried his hunting rifle casually across his shoulder. She needed him to lower his guard, needed time to think. "This is incredible," she said, injecting awe into her voice. "How did you know this was your calling?" Morrison's chest swelled with pride. "Revelation came during my mission in Guatemala. I witnessed such suffering among the indigenous peoples, poverty, disease, despair. The Lord showed me how to end their pain permanently, to guide them directly to His presence without forcing them to endure further earthly trials." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Morrison's missionary work had been a killing spree disguised as religious service. He'd returned to Utah and built this underground temple to continue his twisted ministry, targeting vulnerable travelers who wouldn't be quickly missed. "How many have you helped?" Sarah asked. 47 souls have received final blessings in this sacred space," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Each one a testament to divine mercy." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, her mind racing through possibilities. 47 murders, an underground complex designed for torture and disposal. And somewhere above them, Elder Morrison's wife waited, probably complicit in every death. She was trapped in a nightmare, but nightmares were familiar territory. Some skills once learned never truly disappeared. The basement stretched further than Sarah had imagined, a maze of interconnected rooms carved into the red rock beneath the house. Elder Morrison's flashlight beam danced across rough-hewn walls as he led her deeper into the underground warren, his voice echoing softly as he explained the sanctuary his community had built. "Brother Kimball started the excavation back in 78, Morrison said, his tone reverent. "Said the Lord spoke to him in a vision, told him to prepare a place of refuge for the faithful. Course, the government don't understand our ways." Sarah nodded absently, her mind cataloguing details with automatic precision. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying the mineral scent of stone and something else, something organic and stale that made her stomach clench. Behind them, footsteps echoed as 2 other men followed, their breathing audible in the confined space. They passed through a room lined with shelves of canned goods, then another filled with water barrels and camping equipment. Morrison paused at a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal brackets. "Now, Sister Sarah, I need you to understand something before we go further. What you're about to see might seem unusual to outsiders, but everything we do here is guided by divine purpose." The lock was new, Sarah noticed, industrial grade. Her fingers itched automatically, muscle memory stirring despite her best efforts to suppress it. She'd opened hundreds of locks in her previous life, back when breaking and entering was just another tool in her arsenal for the Bureau. Before everything went wrong, before Marcus died because of her choices. "I trust your judgment, Elder Morrison," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The door swung open to reveal a corridor lined with metal doors, each equipped with a small viewing slot. The stale smell grew stronger, mixing with the unmistakable odor of human habitation. Sarah's training kicked in involuntarily, her senses sharpening as adrenaline began to flood her system. "Our guests sometimes need time to adjust to the truth," Morrison explained, his gentle demeanor unchanged even as Sarah's blood turned to ice. "The world outside has poisoned their minds with lies about our faith, about our way of life. Here they can heal, they can learn." Through the first viewing slot, Sarah glimpsed a young woman sitting on a narrow cot, her dark hair matted and her clothes dirty. The woman looked up at the sound of footsteps, her eyes wide with desperate hope that died when she saw Morrison's face instead of whoever she'd been praying would come. "That's Sister Rebecca," Morrison said fondly. "Found her hitchhiking near Moab 3 months ago. She was resistant at first, full of anger and worldly notions. But she's coming along nicely now, aren't you, Rebecca?" The woman in the cell said nothing, just turned her face to the wall. Sarah fought to keep her breathing steady as they moved past more doors. Each viewing slot revealed another prisoner, because that's what they were, despite Morrison's euphemisms. Young women, mostly, though she spotted at least one man and what looked like a teenage boy. All had the hollow-eyed look of people who'd given up hope. "How many?" Sarah asked, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. 14 souls currently receiving guidance," Morrison replied. "Brother Kimball says the Lord told him we'd need space for 50 before the final gathering. That's why we keep expanding the sanctuary." At the end of the corridor, Morrison stopped before a door identical to the others. "This will be your room, Sister Sarah, just until you've had time to pray and reflect on the truth you've been shown. The Lord led you to us for a reason." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, calculating odds and escape routes with the cold efficiency that had once made her one of the Bureau's most effective undercover agents. The lock was electronic, she noted. Probably motion sensors in the corridor. At least 3 armed men between her and the surface, maybe more. The other prisoners were potential allies, but also liabilities. She couldn't save them all, and attempting to might get everyone killed. "I understand," she said, stepping into the small cell without resistance. The men behind Morrison relaxed slightly, clearly expecting her to fight or plead. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As the door closed and the electronic lock engaged, Sarah sat on the narrow cot and began her assessment. The cell was approximately 8 by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a small ventilation grate near the ceiling. A bucket in the corner served as a toilet. No cameras visible, but that didn't mean they weren't there. She closed her eyes and let herself remember the skills she'd sworn never to use again. Lockpicking, silent movement, pressure points and killing techniques. The psychological manipulation tactics that could turn captors against each other. All the dark tools of her former life that had ultimately led to Marcus bleeding out in that warehouse while she watched helplessly. But Marcus was dead, and these people were alive. 14 souls, Morrison had said. 14 people whose only hope might be a woman who'd promised herself she'd never kill again. Sarah opened her eyes in the darkness and began to plan. The basement stretched further than Sarah had imagined. A warren of interconnected rooms carved from the red sandstone beneath Elder Morrison's property. Her bare feet moved silently across the cold stone floor as she followed the narrow beam of her phone's flashlight. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something organic and wrong. She'd been moving for what felt like hours through the labyrinthine passages, each turn revealing new horrors. Empty cells with rusted chains, medical equipment that belonged in a hospital, not a basement, tables with leather restraints worn smooth from use. The careful organization of it all made her stomach turn. This wasn't the work of a madman. This was systematic, methodical, refined through years of practice. The sound of voices drifted from somewhere ahead, and Sarah quickly switched off her light. She pressed herself against the rough stone wall, controlling her breathing the way Marcus had taught her during those long months in Kandahar. Funny how the skills came back so easily, muscle memory overriding years of trying to forget. "Shipment leaves tomorrow night," a man's voice echoed off the walls. Not Morrison's voice. Someone younger. Phoenix contact confirmed the arrangements. "And the new arrival?" Morrison's familiar tone sent ice through her veins. "Processing as we speak. Clean documentation, just like the others. She'll fetch a premium." Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't just collecting people, they were selling them. Her mind raced through the implications, the scope of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't some isolated lunatic with a god complex. This was human trafficking on an industrial scale, hidden beneath the veneer of religious charity in one of the most remote corners of America. She crept closer, following the voices through a passage that opened into a larger chamber. Dim fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sickly shadows across what looked like an underground office. File cabinets lined one wall, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. Morrison stood with his back to her, speaking to a thin man in a cheap suit who looked more like an accountant than a criminal. "The woman who arrived today," Morrison continued, "she's different. Military training, I'd guess. Could be problematic." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. They knew. Somehow, they'd figured out she wasn't just some stranded motorist. "Want me to handle it?" the thin man asked, his hand moving to something beneath his jacket. "Not yet. She's locked up secure, and she might be more valuable intact. Certain clients pay extra for ones with fight in them." The casual way he discussed her fate made Sarah's vision blur with rage. She forced herself to remain still, to think tactically rather than emotionally. Information first, escape second, revenge could wait. Morrison moved to one of the file cabinets and withdrew a thick folder. "The network's expanding faster than we anticipated. Salt Lake wants to establish 3 new collection points by year's end." The network. Sarah filed the name away. This operation had a structure, a hierarchy that extended far beyond this basement. Morrison was just one node in a larger web. "What about local law enforcement?" the thin man asked. "Sheriff's department is handled. Has been for years. State police don't patrol out here unless there's a specific complaint, and who's going to complain?" Morrison's laugh was cold and confident. Beautiful thing about preying on the lost and forgotten. Nobody misses them. Sarah thought about the other women she'd seen in those cells, their hollow eyes and broken spirits. How many had there been over the years? How many had simply vanished into this underground nightmare, written off as runaways or addicts who'd met predictable ends? The thin man checked his watch. "I should get back. Long drive to Phoenix. Send word when you arrive, and remind our contacts that quality control is paramount. We've built our reputation on delivering exactly what we promise." Sarah watched them shake hands like businessmen, concluding a routine transaction. The banality of evil, she thought, remembering something one of her psychology professors had said years ago. The worst atrocities were often committed by ordinary people who'd convinced themselves they were just doing their jobs. As the thin man headed toward a different exit, apparently there were multiple ways in and out of this place. Morrison returned to the file cabinet. Sarah saw her opportunity. She needed those files, needed to understand the full scope of the operation she was up against. But as she shifted her weight to move closer, her foot knocked against a loose stone. The sound was barely audible, but in the underground silence it might as well have been a gunshot. Morrison's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the office lights. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, but she could see him reaching for something on his desk, a radio or perhaps an alarm. "Security to level 2. His voice crackled through hidden speakers. "Possible breach in Sector 7. The hunt was about to begin." The emergency kit's contents scattered across the concrete floor when Rachel's trembling hands knocked it over. Bandages, antiseptic, and surgical thread tumbled out alongside items that made her stomach clench. Zip ties, duct tape, and a small vial of clear liquid she prayed wasn't what she thought it was. Footsteps echoed in the corridor above. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. Rachel's training kicked in despite the years she'd spent burying it. She pocketed the surgical thread and a small pair of scissors, then swept the remaining supplies back into the kit. Her fingers found the vial last, and after a moment's hesitation, she slipped it into her shoe. The metal door at the top of the stairs creaked open. "Sarah, time for evening prayers." Elder Morrison's voice carried the same warm tone he'd used in the truck, but now it sounded obscene, echoing off these walls. Rachel pressed herself against the wall beside the stairs, heart hammering. She'd counted at least 3 different voices upstairs earlier. Morrison, another man with a raspy smoker's voice, and someone younger, maybe more. "Sarah, don't make this difficult." Morrison's footsteps began descending the wooden stairs. "Brother Kimball has prepared a lovely meal for everyone." Rachel held her breath as his legs came into view. Dark pants, polished shoes that seemed absurdly normal in this nightmare. When he reached the bottom step and turned toward the cells, she moved. Years of muscle memory guided her as she wrapped the surgical thread around his throat from behind, pulling tight. Morrison's hands flew to his neck, clawing at the thin line cutting into his flesh. He was stronger than she'd expected, bucking backward and slamming her into the concrete wall. Stars exploded across her vision, but she held on. This was survival now. This was who she used to be. Morrison gurgled something that might have been a prayer or a curse. His elbow caught her ribs, driving the air from her lungs, but she'd endured worse. She pulled the thread tighter, feeling it bite deep. His struggles weakened. Rachel eased the pressure just enough to keep him conscious but compliant. The thread had left a thin red line across his throat. "The keys," she whispered against his ear. Morrison's hand shook as he reached into his pocket and produced a ring of keys. Rachel snatched them, then used the duct tape from the emergency kit to bind his hands behind his back, more tape across his mouth. She dragged him into the cell she'd just escaped and locked the door. The other prisoners watched with wide eyes as she moved down the corridor, trying keys until she found the ones that worked. The teenage girl stumbled out first, tears streaming down her face. "How many are upstairs?" Rachel asked the businessman. "3 that I've seen. Morrison, an older guy named Kimball, and someone young, college-aged maybe." His voice was steady despite everything. "There might be more." Rachel nodded, her mind already calculating odds and escape routes. "Is there another way out?" "Loading dock on the north side," said the woman who'd been crying earlier. "I saw it when they brought me in. Everyone stays together. We move quiet and fast." Rachel looked at each of them. "If someone falls behind, we don't stop." "Understood?" They nodded, even the teenager who couldn't be more than 16. Rachel led them up the stairs, pausing at the door to listen. Voices drifted from somewhere deeper in the building, a casual conversation about weather and grain prices that made her skin crawl. These men discussed mundane things while keeping human beings caged like animals. The door opened onto a storage area filled with industrial shelving and the smell of motor oil. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the racks. Rachel spotted the loading dock through a gap in the shelving, metal roll-up doors with a regular exit door beside them. She was reaching for the door handle when footsteps approached from the opposite direction. "Elder Morrison, everything all right down there?" Rachel pressed herself against the shelving and motioned for the others to do the same. Through the gaps between boxes, she saw a man in his 20s round the corner, clean-cut, wearing the same white shirt and dark tie as Morrison. When he spotted the open basement door, his hand moved to something at his belt. A radio crackled. "Brother Peterson, what's your status?" The young man, Peterson, lifted the radio to respond, and Rachel knew their window was closing fast. In seconds, alarms would sound. More men would come running. She pulled the vial from her shoe and uncapped it. The liquid inside was odorless, but she recognized the consistency. Chloroform or something similar. Rachel soaked a piece of cloth from the emergency kit, and stepped out from behind the shelving just as Peterson opened his mouth to speak into the radio. The basement stretched further than Sarah had imagined, a labyrinth of concrete corridors that seemed to burrow deep into the Utah earth. Her bare feet moved silently across the cold floor as she followed the faint air current that might lead to an exit. Behind her, the sounds of Elder Morrison's search grew fainter, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he organized a proper hunt. The skill set she'd tried so hard to bury was surfacing with each careful step. Years of CIA training had taught her to move like smoke, to read a building's layout from subtle architectural cues, to find weaknesses where others saw only walls. She'd spent 5 years after Damascus trying to forget these abilities, but muscle memory was proving stronger than conscious will. A door appeared on her left, slightly ajar. Sarah pressed herself against the wall and listened. Silence. She pushed it open and slipped inside, finding herself in what looked like a medical examination room. Steel table, cabinets full of supplies, and something that made her blood freeze. Restraints built into the table, worn smooth from use. The cabinet doors were locked, but her fingers found the weakness in the cheap mechanism within seconds. Inside, syringes, bottles of sedatives, and surgical instruments gleamed under the fluorescent light, but it was the thick folder tucked behind the medical supplies that made her hands shake. Photos, dozens of them, men and women of various ages, all with the same glassy-eyed expression she'd seen on Marcus and the others upstairs. But these photos were different, clinical, like medical documentation. Each was labeled with dates, doses, and notes, written in Morrison's careful handwriting. Subject responds well to increased dosage. Memory integration proceeding as expected. Resistance levels minimal after 3rd week of treatment. Original personality successfully suppressed. Ready for placement. Sarah's training kicked in as she photographed several pages with the phone she'd taken from Morrison's office, though she doubted she'd live long enough to show them to anyone. The scope of this operation was staggering. The dates went back 15 years, with new subjects documented as recently as last month. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Sarah slipped the folder back into its hiding place and eased the door open. Elder Morrison's voice carried from somewhere nearby, calm and patient as always. "Sarah, I know you're frightened, but there's nowhere to go. These tunnels connect to the old mine shafts, and they're not stable. You could get lost down there for days." She moved in the opposite direction of his voice, following the air current that grew stronger with each step. The corridor began to slope upward, and she caught a whiff of sagebrush and desert air. An exit. But as she rounded a corner, she found her path blocked by another elder, this one younger and broader than Morrison. "Hello, Sarah?" His smile was the same beatific expression she'd seen on all their faces. "Elder Morrison is worried about you." There was no choice now. The part of her that had been Rebecca Chen, government assassin, took control. She moved before he could react, driving her knee into his solar plexus while simultaneously striking his throat with the edge of her hand. He dropped without a sound. Sarah grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the source of fresh air. The tunnel ahead showed signs of recent excavation, with modern timber supports replacing old mining beams. Morrison hadn't just inherited this network, he'd expanded it, connected it to something larger. The tunnel opened into a natural cave system that must have been part of the original mine. Ancient wooden tracks still ran along the floor, and the air moved freely through openings she couldn't see in the darkness. But her relief was short-lived. Electric lights had been strung through this section too, and she could hear voices approaching from multiple directions. They weren't just searching randomly anymore. This was a coordinated effort, with people who knew these tunnels intimately. Sarah pressed against the cave wall and forced herself to think strategically. In Damascus, when everything had gone wrong, she'd survived by becoming unpredictable, by doing what her enemies couldn't anticipate. The minecart tracks gave her an idea. If these tunnels really connected to the old mining operation, they would need to surface somewhere, probably at multiple points. The Mormons had clearly been using this system for years, but they would expect her to move toward the most obvious exits. Instead, she followed the tracks deeper into the mine, away from the voices and the electric lights. The darkness closed around her like a familiar friend, and for the first time since her capture, Sarah felt something approaching confidence. They had taken her by surprise once, exploited her desire to forget her past and live a normal life. That mistake wouldn't happen again. The tracks led her through a series of natural chambers, each one bearing the scars of old mining operations, and in the distance, barely audible above the sound of her own breathing, she could hear something that made her heart race with hope, the rumble of traffic on a highway. The knife felt foreign in her hands after 3 years of forced domesticity, but muscle memory kicked in as Maya crept through the underground corridor. The weight distribution, the grip angle, the way shadows could conceal a blade's approach, it all came flooding back like a language she'd tried to forget but never truly lost. She pressed her back against the rough-hewn wall, counting doorways. 7 cells she'd passed, each with a different nameplate. Sarah, Rebecca, Ruth, biblical names for broken women. The air reeked of industrial disinfectant, trying to mask something organic and wrong. "I know about your past troubles," Christensen continued, his footsteps unhurried. "The unfortunate incident in Phoenix. The man who wouldn't take no for an answer. You defended yourself, of course, but the law doesn't always understand a woman's position." Maya's blood chilled. She'd been so careful covering those tracks, creating Elena Vasquez from nothing, burying Maya Chen so deep she'd almost believed the fiction herself. But Elder Christensen had resources, connections that reached far beyond these Utah mountains. "You see, we research our families thoroughly before invitation. Your particular skills, while regrettable in origin, serve a purpose here. Some of our newer sisters require motivation to accept their blessings." The corridor branched ahead. Left led deeper underground. She could feel cooler air flowing from that direction. Right curved back toward what might be the main house. Maya chose left, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent 2 years looking over her shoulder. A soft whimper stopped her cold. It came from behind a reinforced door marked isolation, meditation in progress. Through a small window, Maya glimpsed a girl who couldn't be older than 16, sitting motionless on a concrete floor. Her eyes stared at nothing, pupils dilated to pinpricks. "Ah, you found Sister Charity." Christensen's voice was closer now. "She's learning the virtue of obedience. Amazing what a few days of sensory adjustment can accomplish. The Lord works in mysterious ways." Maya's hand tightened on the knife. The girl's lips moved soundlessly, and Maya recognized the repetitive pattern of forced recitation. She'd seen similar techniques used on captured assets in Chechnya, refined through generations of totalitarian experimentation. "The beautiful thing about our ministry," Christensen continued, "is how we turn society's discarded women into treasures, runaways, addicts, the violently inclined, all transformed into proper helpmates for deserving men. Your friend Sarah? She was a prostitute in Salt Lake City. Now she tends a garden and bakes bread." Maya eased past Charity's door, cataloging details. Security cameras in the upper corners, but old models with obvious blind spots. Emergency lighting that would create shadows, not eliminate them. The lock mechanisms were heavy-duty but standard, nothing she couldn't handle with the right leverage. "The families who receive our sisters are carefully vetted, of course. God-fearing men who understand that feminine nature requires firm guidance. They provide isolated homes, structured environments, frequent pregnancies to occupy wandering thoughts. It's a perfect system." The corridor opened into a larger chamber, carved from living rock. Industrial equipment hummed along the walls, ventilation, power distribution, water filtration. This wasn't a hastily constructed dungeon, but a permanent installation, years in the making. Maya counted 3 exits besides the way she'd entered. "Your assigned family lives in Wyoming," Christensen said, stepping into view at the entrance she'd used. He looked exactly the same as when he'd rescued her from the roadside. Kind eyes, gentle smile, grandfatherly cardigan. "Cattle ranchers with traditional values. They've been praying for a daughter with your particular capabilities. Their previous girls have been disappointing. Maya emerged from behind a water tank, knife visible but not immediately threatening. How many women have you processed through this system? Processed. Christensen chuckled. Such clinical language. We prefer saved. Over the years? Perhaps 200 souls guided to their proper purpose. The network spans 7 states now, with affiliated programs as far as Alberta. And the ones who don't adjust to their new families? The Lord calls some home earlier than others. His expression never wavered, but that's rare. Our preparation methods are quite effective. Sister Sarah's initial resistance lasted only 3 months. Sister Rebecca required 6, but she was exceptionally willful. Maya shifted her grip on the knife, feeling the familiar calm that preceded violence. The scared woman who'd accepted roadside help was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous. Here's what's going to happen, Elder. You're going to unlock every door in this place. Then you're going to call whoever runs security upstairs and tell them everything's fine. After that, we're going to discuss your client list. Christensen's smile widened. Oh, my dear Sister Maya, you still don't understand your situation at all. The lights went out. The ventilation shaft stretched endlessly ahead, a metal tomb that scraped against Maya's shoulders with each forward crawl. Her ribs screamed where they'd been bruised, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind her, the compound had erupted into chaos, shouting voices, slamming doors, the mechanical whir of elevators carrying search teams to every level. She'd memorized the building's layout during her captivity, cataloguing every detail with the methodical precision her handler had beaten into her during those brutal training years in Prague. The main shaft would branch in 60 feet, leading either to the kitchen exhaust or the server room. Kitchen meant potential exit, but also the highest concentration of people. Server room meant isolation, but possible dead ends. A metallic clang echoed through the ductwork behind her. They'd found her entry point. Maya chose the server room. The shaft angled downward, and she had to brace her feet against the sides to control her descent. Her fingers, still raw from picking the lock, left smears of blood on the aluminum. The darkness pressed against her like a living thing, but she'd learned long ago to trust her other senses. The airflow told her about upcoming turns. The vibrations through the metal warned her when footsteps passed below. She reached the server room junction and paused, listening. Silence. Through the grate, she could see rows of blinking servers casting an eerie blue glow across the cramped space. More importantly, she could see the emergency exit sign glowing red in the far corner. The grate came away easily, too easily. Her survival instincts screamed a warning, but the sound of voices in the main shaft behind her left no choice. She dropped into the server room, landing in a crouch that sent fire through her injured ribs. "Hello, Maya." Elder Jameson stepped out from behind a server rack, his kind smile intact despite the pistol in his hand. "Did you really think we wouldn't anticipate this route? We've been doing this for a very long time." Maya's mind raced through options. The room was small, maybe 12 by 15 feet. Server racks created natural barriers, but also limited her movement. The emergency exit was 15 feet away, but Jameson stood between her and freedom. His finger rested casually on the trigger, suggesting familiarity with firearms that contradicted his gentle missionary facade. "You've caused quite a stir," he continued, his voice maintaining that same paternal warmth that had first lured her into his truck. "Brother Marcus is particularly upset about his nose, but I told him that passion is exactly what we're looking for in our special candidates." "Special candidates for what?" Maya kept her voice steady while her peripheral vision mapped the room. A fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, thick power cables she could potentially use as weapons, the distance to each server rack calculated in her muscle memory. "You already know, don't you? Deep down, you recognize what this place really is." Jameson's eyes glittered in the server lights. "We're a recruitment center, Maya. We find people with particular skills, people running from particular pasts, and we offer them purpose again." The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. "You're building an army." We're offering salvation to the damned." His smile widened. "Do you know how many trained killers are wandering America right now? Former military, ex-intelligence, private contractors whose wars have ended. They're lost souls, Maya. Broken people seeking meaning. We give them family. We give them mission. We give them targets that serve a higher purpose." Maya thought of the other prisoners she'd seen, the hollow look in their eyes that she'd mistaken for defeat. It wasn't surrender. It was the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers waiting for orders. The families you're supposed to be helping are helping us identify threats to the faithful, enemies of righteousness. Jameson's voice hardened. Judges who rule against religious freedom, politicians who promote deviant lifestyles, journalists who mock the word of God. They all require correction. A ventilation fan kicked on overhead, the sudden noise making Jameson glance upward for just a fraction of a second. Maya moved. She dove right, rolling behind the nearest server rack as his pistol cracked. The bullet sparked off aluminum housing, filling the air with the acrid smell of fried electronics. Maya grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and triggered it as she spun around the rack's edge, filling the narrow space with white chemical fog. Jameson fired blind, his shots going wide as Maya closed the distance. She swung the heavy cylinder like a club, connecting with his wrist and sending the pistol skittering across the floor. His other hand came up to block her follow-up strike, and she saw the hardened calluses of someone who'd been in far more fights than any missionary should have. They grappled in the dissipating fog, and Maya realized with cold certainty that Elder Jameson wasn't just running this operation. He was a graduate of it, another lost soul who'd found purpose in service to a cause that justified any atrocity. The emergency exit alarm began wailing as someone forced the door. More voices filled the corridor beyond. Time was up. The workshop fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and distant screaming from somewhere deeper in the compound. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete wall, listening to footsteps echo through the corridors above. 3 sets, maybe 4. They were searching methodically, room by room. She'd managed to free Marcus from his restraints, but he was barely conscious, his face swollen beyond recognition. The other captives huddled in the far corner, 2 women and a teenage boy, all bearing the hollow stare of prolonged captivity. They flinched when she approached, too broken to trust anyone wearing the clothes of their captors. "We're getting out," Sarah whispered, checking the makeshift weapons she'd assembled from the workshop tools. A sharpened screwdriver, heavy wrench, industrial zip ties. "But I need you to follow my lead exactly." The older woman, maybe 50, with graying hair matted with blood, shook her head. "You don't understand, Elder Morrison. He has people everywhere. Police, state officials. Even if we escape, they'll find us. Then we make sure Morrison can't give orders anymore." Something in Sarah's voice made them look at her differently. The teenage boy, couldn't be more than 16, sat up straighter. "You're not like the others who tried to help us. You're—" He searched for the word. "Dangerous," the younger woman finished, her voice barely audible. Sarah didn't deny it. The skills she'd buried for 3 years were flooding back with crystalline clarity. Room clearance techniques, pressure points, silent movement. Her handler had called her their best asset before everything went to hell in Damascus, before she'd killed the wrong target and disappeared into a new identity. Footsteps approached the workshop door. Sarah motioned for silence and positioned herself beside the entrance, screwdriver raised. The lock clicked. Elder Hendricks entered first, flashlight sweeping the room. Sarah drove the screwdriver into his neck before he could cry out, catching his falling body and lowering it quietly. His blood was warm on her hands, familiar as breathing. The second man, she didn't recognize him, stepped through the doorway and froze when he saw his companion's body. Sarah's wrench caught him across the temple with a wet crack. He dropped like a stone. "Jesus Christ," Marcus mumbled, finally alert enough to process what he'd witnessed. "2 down," Sarah said, already stripping weapons from the bodies, a .45 caliber pistol and a shotgun. She checked the chambers, both loaded. How many more guards in the building? Maybe 6 or 7, the older woman said. But Elder Morrison keeps the real security upstairs. Armed men who aren't from around here. Professional contractors. Sarah had suspected as much. Morrison's operation was too sophisticated for local recruits. Someone was funding this, providing resources. The kind of someone who dealt in human trafficking on an international scale. She distributed the zip ties to the captives. Anyone who can't fight, secure the exits behind us. Anyone who can... She looked at Marcus, who was struggling to stand but had murder in his eyes. Watch my back. They moved through the underground corridors like ghosts. Sarah took point, using hand signals she'd learned in agency training. The compound was larger than she'd initially realized. Multiple levels carved into the hillside, with holding cells, processing rooms, and what looked like surgical facilities. In one room, she found documents scattered across a desk. Shipping manifests, flight schedules, financial records. The operation extended far beyond Utah, with connections to buyers in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Morrison wasn't just collecting people, he was running a sophisticated trafficking network under the cover of religious charity. A photograph caught her attention. Morrison shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, outside what looked like a government building. She pocketed the image along with a list of names and account numbers. Voices echoed from the stairwell leading to the main floor. Multiple men, moving with tactical precision. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct voices, possibly more. They knew the prisoners had escaped. There's another exit, the teenage boy whispered, through the old mine shaft. Elder Morrison showed it to us once, said we'd never find our way out even if we tried. Sarah smiled grimly. Cave systems and underground navigation had been part of her training. Show me. They retreated deeper into the compound, past rooms Sarah didn't want to examine too closely. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of earth and decay. Behind them, shouts indicated their absence had been discovered. The mine shaft entrance was concealed behind a false wall in what appeared to be a storage room. Ancient wooden supports and rusted mining equipment suggested the tunnels predated Morrison's operation by decades. It comes out about 2 miles north, the boy explained, near the old uranium processing plant. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already working the angles. Morrison would expect them to run, to disappear into the night and hope law enforcement would believe their story. That's what victims did. But Sarah wasn't a victim anymore. She was something Morrison had never encountered, a predator with her own agenda and the skills to execute it. Get them out through the mine, she told Marcus, pressing the .45 into his hands. Contact FBI field office in Salt Lake City. Ask for Agent Catherine Wells. Tell her Sarah Chen sent you. Marcus grabbed her arm. Where are you going? To finish this. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning air like a death knell. Sarah pressed herself against the cold rock wall of the cave, counting engines. 3, maybe 4. They'd found her faster than expected. Marcus's voice carried across the canyon, amplified by a bullhorn. Sarah, there's no need for this to be difficult. You're hurt, you're tired, and you're alone. Let us help you. She almost laughed at the grotesque irony. Help, the same word he'd used when he first pulled over on that desolate highway 3 days ago. The same gentle tone that had lured her into his truck, into his world of carefully orchestrated horror. Her ribs screamed as she shifted position, checking the handgun she'd taken from the compound. 7 rounds left. Against how many of them? The math wasn't encouraging, but Sarah had survived worse odds. The muscle memory of her military training was flooding back now, washing away years of careful civilian conditioning. Footsteps echoed off the canyon walls. They were spreading out, trying to box her in, standard search pattern. She closed her eyes and listened, cataloguing their positions by sound alone. 2 coming up the main trail, 1 circling left, another moving right through the brush. You saw what we're building here, Marcus called out, his voice closer now. The Lord's work requires sacrifice. Those people you're so concerned about, they're serving a higher purpose. Their suffering purifies them. Sarah's jaw clenched. The memory of the underground chambers flashed through her mind. The rows of cells, the broken faces, the systematic degradation masked as salvation. Whatever twisted theology drove Marcus and his followers, it ended today. She heard the soft scrape of boots on stone. The rightmost searcher was almost to her position. Sarah counted his steps, timing his approach. When his shadow fell across the cave entrance, she moved. The man never saw her coming. Her knife found the gap between his ribs before he could cry out. She lowered his body silently, taking his rifle and ammunition. The weight felt familiar in her hands, like greeting an old friend. "Brother Collins?" Marcus's voice held the first note of uncertainty she'd heard. "Report your position." Sarah was already moving, using the dead man's planned route in reverse. The terrain worked in her favor here, too many rocks and blind corners for their superior numbers to matter much. She'd learned urban warfare in Fallujah, but the principles translated. The second searcher found his partner's body 30 seconds later. His shocked intake of breath gave Sarah the target she needed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder and another threat vanished. "She's armed!" The shout echoed through the canyon. "Southwest sector, 2 men down." Good. Fear would make them sloppy. Sarah sprinted across open ground, reaching the next cluster of boulders as bullets sparked off stone behind her. They were shooting wild now, accuracy sacrificed for volume. Marcus's voice cut through the gunfire. "Take her alive! She's no good to us dead!" That confirmed what Sarah had suspected. This wasn't just about silencing a witness. They needed her for something specific. The knowledge gave her an edge. They'd hesitate when she wouldn't. She worked her way up the canyon wall, using handholds she'd scouted during the night. The elevation would give her better sight lines and force them to expose themselves if they wanted to follow. Her damaged ribs protested every pull, but pain was just information now. She could process it later. From her new position, Sarah counted 5 figures moving below. Marcus directed them with hand signals, his calm facade finally cracking. He'd underestimated her, assumed the frightened woman who'd stumbled into his web was all there was to see. He was learning otherwise. The rifle's scope brought his face into sharp focus. One shot would end this. But Sarah held her fire, watching his pattern. Marcus was too smart to stay exposed for long, and she needed to understand his plan. "You can't run forever," he called up to her. "We know these mountains better than you do. There's nowhere to go." He was probably right about the terrain. But Sarah wasn't planning to run much longer. The compound she'd escaped from was only 2 miles south, still holding its cargo of victims. The local authorities Marcus claimed to have corrupted might be real or imaginary, but the state police were clean as far as she knew. Her stolen radio from the compound would reach them if she could get close enough to a repeater. The real question was whether she could get there alive. Marcus gestured to his remaining men, and they began a coordinated advance up the canyon wall. Professional movements, military training. These weren't just religious fanatics. They were soldiers in service to something darker. Sarah checked her ammunition one more time, then settled the rifle against her shoulder. The first man was almost within range. The war for those underground souls was about to begin in earnest. The ventilation shaft stretched endlessly ahead, a metal throat that seemed to swallow the beam of Maya's dying flashlight. Behind her, the voices had grown quieter, but hadn't disappeared entirely. They were searching methodically now, checking every room, every hiding place. Her elbows and knees were raw from crawling across the corrugated metal, and the space was so narrow her shoulders scraped the sides with each movement forward. The air grew thinner as she progressed, stale and metallic, carrying the faint scent of decay that seemed to permeate everything in this nightmare compound. A junction appeared ahead. The shaft branched left and right. Maya paused, pressing her ear to each opening. From the left came the distant hum of machinery, possibly the building's main HVAC system. The right passage carried something else, voices but different ones. Younger, frightened. She chose right. The shaft began to slope downward, and Maya realized she was descending into another level of the compound, one she hadn't known existed. Her military training kicked in automatically. Always map your environment, always know your exits, always understand the terrain. Elder Morrison's operation was larger than she'd initially assessed. Much larger. The voices grew clearer as she crawled. Children's voices mixed with adult murmurs of comfort that sounded forced, rehearsed. Maya's blood chilled as fragments of conversation drifted up through the ventilation grates. Tomorrow morning after the ceremony, frightened, but that's normal for the new ones. Elder Morrison says this group is special. Maya reached a grate and peered down into a large underground room that looked like a dormitory. Dozens of narrow beds lined the walls, most occupied by children and teenagers ranging from perhaps 8 to 17 years old. They wore identical grey clothing and sat with the peculiar stillness of the heavily medicated or deeply traumatized. At the far end of the room, 2 women in modest dresses moved between the beds, distributing small paper cups. Even from her elevated position, Maya could see the pharmaceutical precision of their movements. This wasn't comfort, it was medical management. One of the children, a girl with dark hair who couldn't have been more than 12, began to cry softly. One of the women immediately approached with another cup, coaxing the girl to drink. Within minutes, the crying stopped, replaced by the same vacant compliance that marked the others. Maya's hands clenched into fists. During her years in Black Ops, she'd encountered human trafficking rings before, but nothing quite like this. This wasn't just about moving people, it was about breaking them first, molding them into something else entirely. A new voice echoed through the chamber, and Maya's entire body went rigid with recognition. "How are our young pilgrims tonight, Sister Rebecca?" Elder Morrison entered the dormitory with the same gentle smile he'd worn when he'd first offered Maya help on that dark highway. But seeing him here, among these stolen children, his benevolent mask finally slipped completely. His eyes moved across the room with the calculating assessment of a rancher inspecting livestock. "Peaceful, Elder Morrison," replied one of the women. "The new arrivals have adjusted well to their medication schedule." "Excellent. Tomorrow's ceremony will mark their final transition into our family." Morrison approached the crying girl's bed, placing a paternal hand on her shoulder. "This one seems resistant still. We can increase her dosage if needed." No, the buyers prefer them alert enough to follow simple commands. We'll work with her personally before the transfer." Maya bit down hard on her tongue to keep from making a sound. Transfer, buyers, the full scope of Morrison's operation crystallized in her mind. He wasn't just collecting vulnerable people for some twisted religious purpose, he was processing them, breaking their will, then selling them to the highest bidder. Morrison checked his watch. "Sister Rebecca, please prepare transport schedules for the morning shipment. Our friends in Nevada are expecting their delivery before noon." "Of course, Elder." "And Sister Mary, increase security sweeps on the upper levels. We had an incident tonight with one of our newer guests. She's proven more resourceful than anticipated." Maya's pulse quickened. They were still hunting her, but now she understood the stakes weren't just her own survival. If she died tonight, if she failed to escape and expose this place, dozens of children would disappear into a pipeline of human misery that stretched far beyond this compound. Morrison moved toward the exit, pausing at the doorway. "Actually, have the children prepared for early transport. 4 a.m. instead of 7. Our resourceful guest has me feeling cautious." As his footsteps faded, Maya carefully began backing away from the grate. The ventilation shaft suddenly felt like more than an escape route. It was a lifeline to the outside world, the only chance these children had for rescue. But first, she needed to reach the surface alive, and Elder Morrison had just made that considerably more difficult. The concrete floor beneath Sarah's feet vibrated with each muffled explosion from above. Dust rained down from the ceiling as she led the group of survivors through the narrow maintenance corridor she'd discovered behind a false wall in Elder Morrison's study. The building groaned and settled around them, a dying beast exhaling its final breaths. "How much further?" whispered Maria, clutching her daughter close. The little girl hadn't spoken since they'd found her, but her eyes tracked every shadow with hypervigilant intensity that Sarah recognized all too well. "Not far." Sarah's voice was steady despite the chaos erupting overhead. The tactical charges she'd rigged throughout Morrison's compound were working exactly as intended, creating enough confusion and structural damage to mask their escape, while forcing the remaining cultists to focus on evacuation rather than pursuit. Behind them, she could hear Morrison's voice echoing through the compound's PA system, no longer the gentle shepherd, but a rabid wolf calling for blood. "Find them! Sarah Chen thinks she can destroy what we've built here, but she doesn't understand. We are eternal. We are—" His words cut off abruptly as another explosion rocked the building. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. That would be the communications center. They reached a junction where 3 corridors met. Sarah held up her hand, signaling the group to stop while she listened. Footsteps pounded overhead, heavy boots moving in formation. Morrison's security team was sweeping the upper levels, but they hadn't found the entrance to these service tunnels yet. She'd bought them time, but not much. "There," she pointed to the leftmost passage. "That leads to the old mine shaft. From there we can reach the surface about half a mile from the main compound." "What about the others?" asked David, one of Morrison's former inner circle, who'd finally seen through the elder's mask of benevolence. "There are still people up there." The weight of that truth settled over the group like a shroud. Sarah had made harder choices before, in places where moral absolutes dissolved into shades of grey, but it never got easier. The difference was that back then she'd been following orders. Tonight, every decision was hers alone. "Miss Sarah?" The voice belonged to Tommy, a boy of maybe 12 who'd been in the compound for 3 years. "Are we really going to be okay?" She turned to look at him. Thin face, hollow eyes, the particular stillness that came from learning too young that survival meant invisibility. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "You're going to be safe." The tunnel began to slope upward, and Sarah could feel the subtle shift in air pressure that meant they were approaching the surface. She checked her watch, 23 minutes since the first explosion. Morrison's people would have called for backup by now, and local law enforcement would be en route. She needed to get the survivors somewhere secure and make contact with the FBI task force she'd reached out to before infiltrating the compound. Agent Reynolds had been skeptical when she'd first approached him with intelligence about Morrison's operation. A former CIA operative with a burned identity wasn't exactly the most reliable source, but the evidence she'd gathered over the past months— financial records, shipping manifests, testimonies from escaped victims— had been impossible to ignore. The raid should have happened tomorrow at dawn. Instead, Sarah had been forced to accelerate the timeline when Morrison had grown suspicious of her true identity. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern, moonlight filtering down through a crack in the ceiling. Sarah could smell pine and cold mountain air. They were close now. "David," she called softly, "help me boost the children up. There's a ledge about 8 feet up that leads to the surface entrance." As they worked to lift the survivors to safety, Sarah's enhanced hearing caught something that made her blood freeze. The distant sound of vehicles approaching. Too many vehicles? Moving too fast to be rescue personnel. Morrison hadn't just called for backup. He'd activated his network. She thought of the maps she'd found in his office, marked with locations across 3 states, safe houses, recruitment centers, processing facilities. The compound in Utah was just one node in a web that stretched much further than she'd imagined. The last child disappeared through the surface entrance. Sarah followed, emerging into the star-filled Utah night with the knowledge that destroying Morrison's operation was only the beginning. The barn doors burst open as Sarah reached the main house, Elder Morrison's roar of discovery echoing across the compound. She had maybe 3 minutes before he organized the others into a proper search. The skills Danny had taught her 15 years ago whispered instructions: move fast, think faster, use their assumptions against them. The kitchen window she'd marked earlier slid open silently. Sarah dropped through, her boots hitting linoleum as voices erupted from the direction of the barn. She could hear Morrison barking orders, sending people to check the perimeter, the road, the other buildings. They thought she was running. Good. Let them think that. She found Morrison's study behind a door marked with a small brass nameplate. The room reeked of leather and old paper, dominated by a massive oak desk and filing cabinets that looked like they belonged in a government office. Sarah's fingers found the locked drawer she'd noticed during her first visit, when Morrison had graciously shown her around his humble home. The lock picked easily, too easily. Her stomach dropped as the drawer slid open to reveal it had been a test all along. Inside lay a thick manila folder with her real name typed on the tab. Not Sarah Collins, the identity she'd worn for 8 years. Her birth name, the one Danny had died protecting. The folder contained newspaper clippings about Danny's death, surveillance photos of her in 3 different cities, copies of documents she thought had been destroyed forever. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Morrison's careful script. Subject displays advanced tactical knowledge. Recommend elevated security protocols during processing. Processing. Like she was meat. Footsteps thundered past the study door. Someone shouted that they'd found her escape route through the barn. Perfect. Sarah photographed every page with her phone, her hands steady despite the ice in her veins. Whatever Morrison's network was, it was bigger than Utah. These photos showed watchers in places she'd lived, people she'd trusted. How long had they been hunting her? A new set of footsteps approached the study, slower, more deliberate. Sarah closed the folder, slid the drawer shut, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. The footsteps paused outside. "I know you're in there." Morrison's voice carried an odd note of respect. The barn trick was clever, very professional. Makes me wonder who trained you. Sarah's hand found the letter opener from his desk. Not much of a weapon, but Danny had taught her that anything could be lethal with proper application. Morrison's footsteps moved away from the door. "See, the thing about people like you," his voice continued from the hallway, "is you always think you're smarter than everyone else. But I've been collecting dangerous people for 23 years. I know how you think." A floorboard creaked near the window. Sarah spun, but Morrison wasn't there. The sound had come from outside, someone moving into position. Her blood chilled as she understood. He wasn't trying to catch her, he was herding her. "The folder was bait, obviously," Morrison continued conversationally. "Though I'm curious what you made of your file. Quite comprehensive, isn't it? Took us 6 years to track you down after Denver. You're very good at disappearing." Sarah's mind raced. Denver had been 4 identities ago. If they'd been tracking her for 6 years, then they knew about the others too. The bank manager in Phoenix, the real estate developer in Sacramento, all the monsters she'd put down after Danny's death had taught her that some people couldn't be stopped by law or conscience. "You can come out now," Morrison said, "or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Through the study window, Sarah could see figures moving in the darkness, at least 4, maybe more. They'd surrounded the house while she'd been reading her own death warrant, but Morrison had made one crucial error in his psychological profile. He thought she was running from her past. In reality, she'd spent 8 years preparing for this moment, the day someone finally connected her to the skills Danny had died teaching her, the day she stopped hiding and remembered what she really was. Sarah smiled in the darkness as she moved toward the door. Morrison's network had made the same mistake as all the others. They'd assumed she was prey because she looked like prey, because she acted frightened and helpless when it served her purposes. Time to show them the difference between a victim and a predator who'd learned to wear a victim's face. The study door opened silently under her hand. Morrison stood in the hallway, his back turned, speaking quietly into a radio. 3 steps away. Close enough. "Elder Morrison," Sarah said softly. He turned, and his expression shifted as he saw something new in her eyes, something that made him reach for the radio's panic button. Too late. The tunnel shook as another explosion ripped through the compound above. Dust rained down from the concrete ceiling while Sarah pressed herself against the wall, counting the seconds between detonations. The FBI had moved faster than she'd expected, or maybe Elder Matthews had less control over his followers than he believed. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the narrow corridor behind her. The skills she'd buried for 5 years had emerged with brutal efficiency when cornered. Her hands still trembled from the muscle memory, from the way her fingers had found pressure points and vulnerable arteries without conscious thought. The woman she'd tried to become would have hesitated. The woman she'd been before had kept her alive. A figure rounded the corner ahead, rifle raised. Sarah recognized him. Brother Morrison, the one who'd brought her meals in the cell. His young face was pale with fear and religious fervor, a dangerous combination that made him unpredictable. "Sister Sarah," he called out, voice cracking. "Elder Matthews wants to see you. He says God has a plan for all this." She stepped into the light, hands visible but ready. "Where is he?" "The sanctuary. He's gathering the faithful. Says the government can't touch us in God's house." Morrison's grip on the rifle was amateur, fingers in the wrong position. "He wants you to stand with us for the final blessing." The final blessing. Sarah's blood chilled as she realized what Matthews intended. Mass suicide disguised as martyrdom, with her as the catalyst, the lost soul whose rescue had triggered their persecution. She'd seen this pattern before in other operations, other fanatics who preferred death to capture. "I'll come with you," she said, moving closer. Morrison relaxed slightly, lowering the barrel a few inches. It was enough. Her hand shot out, striking his wrist, while her other arm swept up to catch the rifle. He gasped as she twisted his arm behind his back, the weapon now pressed against his temple. "How many are with him?" she whispered. 40, maybe 50. The families with children went first. Tears streamed down his face. "They're already gone, sister. The little ones drank it like grape juice." The words hit her like physical blows. Children. Always the children paid the price for adult madness. She thought of Emma, Morrison's 7-year-old daughter who'd smiled shyly during the evening meals, of little David who'd asked if she wanted to see his drawings of angels. Where are the others? The ones still alive? Main sanctuary. But they've already started the ceremony. Elder Matthews said the government wants to separate us from God's love, but we'll be together in the celestial kingdom. Another explosion shook the tunnels, closer this time. The FBI was methodically working their way through the compound's defenses. Sarah had maybe minutes before they breached the sanctuary level, and by then Matthews would have completed his twisted vision. She released Morrison but kept the rifle. "Is there another way to the sanctuary?" He nodded toward a side passage. "Service tunnel. Comes up behind the altar." "Go. Find somewhere safe and stay down until the shooting stops." She started toward the passage, then turned back. "And Morrison? When they find you, tell them you helped. Tell them about the children." The service tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders, thick with decades of dust and the scent of old concrete. As she crawled forward, she could hear singing, hymns drifting through the ventilation system, voices raised in harmony, beautiful and terrible in their certainty. The tunnel ended at a grate that opened behind a false wall. Through the gaps, Sarah could see the sanctuary, rows of wooden benches filled with people in their Sunday best. At the front, Matthews stood behind a simple altar, dressed in white robes instead of his usual dark suit. Purple liquid filled dozens of paper cups arranged on silver trays. "Brothers and sisters," Matthews was saying, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she'd first heard on the highway. "Tonight we complete the greatest rescue of all. We rescue ourselves from a world that would corrupt our children and destroy our faith." A woman in the front row stood, her infant son cradled in her arms. Sarah recognized her, Sister Rebecca, who'd been kind to her during the first days of captivity. Rebecca lifted one of the cups with her free hand. "I testify that this is right," she said, voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I testify that God wants us to come home." Sarah's fingers found the latches on the grate. 3 quick movements, and she'd have a clear shot at Matthews. But 50 people sat between her and the altar, 50 people who believed they were choosing salvation over persecution. Could she stop them all? Did she have the right to try? The baby began to cry as Rebecca brought the cup toward his lips. The sound cut through the hymns, through Sarah's doubts, through every justification for hesitation. Some choices were simple, even when they weren't easy. She kicked out the grate and rolled into the sanctuary, rifle already rising to her shoulder. The compound burned behind Sarah as she half-carried, half-dragged Marcus toward the road. Every few steps, she glanced back at the orange glow painting the desert sky, expecting to see figures emerging from the flames. But there was only smoke and the distant sound of sirens. Someone must have seen the fire from town. Marcus groaned, his weight growing heavier against her shoulder. The bullet had torn through his leg, and despite the makeshift tourniquet she'd fashioned from her torn shirt, blood still seeped through the fabric. They needed medical attention, but more than that, they needed to disappear before anyone started asking questions about the bodies left in that burning hell. "Stay with me," she whispered, adjusting her grip on him. "We're almost there." Her stolen truck sat where she'd hidden it, behind a cluster of juniper trees, keys still dangling from the ignition. She'd learned long ago to always have an exit strategy, though she'd hoped never to need those skills again. The past week had stripped away every illusion she'd built about leaving that life behind. As she helped Marcus into the passenger seat, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "The others," he gasped. "Rebecca! The girl with the scar! They're safe." Sarah started the engine, gravel spraying as she pulled onto the dirt road. "I sent them ahead with directions to the highway. They'll flag down help." It was partially true. She'd freed everyone she could find in those underground chambers, but she knew from experience that surviving captivity was only the beginning. The real fight would be learning to live with what had been done to them and what they'd been forced to do to survive. The headlights cut through the darkness as they reached the main road. Sarah turned away from town, away from the approaching sirens. They needed distance before anyone discovered what remained of Elder Patterson's operation. She thought of his face in those final moments, the disbelief in his eyes when she'd revealed who she really was, not a lost soul to be collected, but a predator who'd learned to hunt predators. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice steadier now despite his injuries. "Really?" Sarah kept her eyes on the road. She'd known this question would come eventually. Someone who got out of a different kind of hell. Someone who thought she could run far enough to forget. But you didn't forget. She flexed her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar ache in her knuckles from the night's violence. "I just got better at pretending." The miles passed in silence. Marcus dozed fitfully beside her, and Sarah let her mind wander to the phone calls she'd have to make. There were people, unofficial people, who specialized in cleaning up messes like this. They'd ensure the surviving victims received proper care without uncomfortable questions about their rescuers' methods. Money would change hands, records would be altered, and Sarah Chen would remain a ghost. She'd done it before, in other places, when her past had caught up with her, despite her best efforts to bury it. There was always another Patterson, another network of corruption hiding behind respectability. And there were always people like her, products of violence who'd learned to weaponize their trauma against those who created it. Dawn was breaking when she finally pulled into the parking lot of a small hospital outside Salt Lake City. She'd called ahead using one of her untraceable phones, speaking to a doctor who owed favors to people who didn't officially exist. Marcus would receive treatment, and his story would be carefully managed. "This isn't over, is it?" Marcus said as she helped him out of the truck. "There are others like Patterson." Sarah looked back toward the southern horizon, where smoke might still be rising from the ashes of the compound. "There are always others, and you'll find them." It wasn't a question. Marcus had seen enough in those underground chambers to understand the scope of what they'd uncovered. One network destroyed, but how many others remained? How many people were still trapped in similar hells, waiting for someone to remember they existed? "Maybe," Sarah said. Or maybe I'll try running again. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She'd tried running for 5 years, building a quiet life and telling herself she'd earned peace. But peace was a luxury she couldn't afford, while people like Patterson turned human beings into commodities. A nurse emerged from the hospital entrance, wheelchair in hand. As they transferred Marcus to her care, he caught Sarah's arm one last time. "Thank you," he said simply. She drove away as the sun painted the mountains gold, already thinking about the next call she needed to make, the next lead to follow. Sarah Chen was done running.